and welcome to Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary's live stream event, COVID-19, Fear, Facts, and Faith. Tonight's event is entitled New Wineskins for a New Normal, Biblical and Pastoral Perspectives. My name is Professor Ken Barnes. I'll be your host for this evening. And as we do with all things at Gordon-Conwell, we'd like to begin this evening's proceedings with a word of prayer. Would you please join me? Heavenly Father, we give you thanks tonight for the wonders of technology that allows us to reach out to our brothers and sisters across the globe to discuss what it means to be the church in these difficult and unsettling times. Help us to claim the words of Isaiah 41:10. Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. Amen. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to our panelists, whom I'll introduce in just a moment. We're going to have a group of panelists tonight that include Gordon-Conwell faculty members and pastors who represent urban and suburban and rural churches. We're going to begin the evening by unpacking some of the unprecedented ways in which the COVID-19 crisis has impacted the church as we've always known it. And then we're going to explore some biblical examples of how God's people throughout the ages have had to deal with existential threats in the past. Consider how those experiences can serve as useful models for us in our current context. After the panel has shared insights, we're going to open up questions from you, the audience, viewers. You can send us the questions you'd like to ask electronically through Facebook Live. We hope you'll find this evening's event to be useful and inspiring. Our first panel, Dr. Jim Longhurst, has spent over 40 years as a church pastor both in the United States and abroad. He currently serves as executive director of the Public Care Forum, a nonprofit organization that fosters conversations of consequence between local congregations and their communities. The Public Square Forum is also a co-host for all of the COVID-19 events that we're running. I'm also happy to introduce my colleague, Dr. Carol Kaminski. Carol is professor of Old Testament and chair of the Biblical Studies Department at Gordon-Conwell Seminary. She's also the founder and CEO of Casket Empty Media, LLC, which is a company that produces multimedia Bible study tools that focus on the redemptive history of God's people throughout both the Old and the New Testament. I'm also very pleased to introduce my other colleague, Dr. Virginia Ward. Dr. Ward, in addition to being an associate pastor of an inner city church here in the Boston area, is also assistant professor of youth ministry and leadership, as well as assistant dean of Gordon-Conwell's CUME program. And last but not least is my friend and colleague, Jason McConnell. Dr. McConnell is the senior pastor of two rural congregations in Vermont, and he also serves as a co-director of the Ockenga Fellows program at Gordon-Conwell, where he also serves as a tutor in the Doctor of Ministry program. So we have four wonderful and very experienced panelists and scholars with us tonight. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for taking the time to be here. So without further ado, Jim, you came up with the title for tonight's event. Can you explain to us what you mean by new wineskins for a new normal?
Yes, Ken, with the social distancing, people working at home, people slowing down, there's the big disconnect from all the social networks that we've previously been a part of. And so in the midst of that, there's this outpouring of longing for relationships that's being unleashed. And the stats from Verizon, for example, give evidence to that. Verizon's data tells us that there's some 800 million phone calls that are being made by us each day. That's an increase of 107%. That's more than double the phone calls that are made on a Mother's Day. And these phone calls that we're making with each other, well, they're lasting a lot longer. And so in our churches, instead of gathering in the building for our worship and meetings, now we're gathering in our scattered homes in our communities. So this is a new form, or in Jesus' words, it's a new wineskin that he's filling with his very life, with the new wine of the reality of his living presence. And so there's this big shift that's happening. And it's having to reimagine church as a decentralized network of small expressions of church in and out and about in the community. This one, John Havlick, he summarizes what's happening to us just as we're walking through this. The church is never a place, but a people. Never a fold, but always a flock. Never a sacred building, but always a believing assembly. A structure of brick or marble can no more be a church than your clothes of serge and satin can be you. That's new wine for new wineskins that we're involved in, Ken. And so I turn to you, Virginia and Jason, and Carol and Ken join in. How are you seeing what we're experiencing with these new wineskins manifesting itself in your own contexts? Virginia, we'll start with you.
Well, thank you for having me in this conversation, Jim and my colleagues. I'm really looking forward to this. So what I'm seeing, and I heard something said today at the Orange Conference, that in our settings, we're seeing that we have to put a period on the end of where we are right now. We keep trying to go back. Many churches have gone, trying to go back, trying to recreate what was, and then looking forward to the stay being lifted so that we can go back to what was. But that has ended, and we have to turn to a new chapter and be totally open to explore what that's going to look like.
Jason, how about in your rural Vermont, up at the border?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's a delight to be here with all of you. Jim, first, I would just commend you on the title for tonight's event. I love that, the new wineskins, which comes from Luke chapter 5. And it's interesting in that chapter, Jesus ends with these words, and no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for he says the old wine is better. I'll be honest, I agree with Jesus, both in wine and in ministry forms, which is what we're talking about here tonight. I'm a pastor who prefers the old wine and the old wineskins. I like to think, why are we changing things unless it's really necessary to do that? And of course, we find ourselves in a situation where we have to change. And so as I've talked with pastors in rural contexts and in all sorts of contexts, some love that rapid change that needs to take place. It's invigorated them. And then there's others like myself that resist that and says, digital worship services, Zoom meetings all day long. These are changes that, again, for me, I don't particularly like. I'd like to go back to that old wine if I could. But the reality is that even in rural contexts, everyone's had to change with our physical distancing, with our lockdowns, which are all very necessary in this day. And so I've watched pastors adapt in a lot of different ways, a lot of continuums, a lot of different ways to do church, a lot of different ways to do discipleship. And I think everyone's trying to figure out what's best for their church and their community.
Yeah. Ken, Carol, any comments?
Well, let me just jump in and say that we're finding the same kind of change in the academy as well. Graduate education is never going to be the same. I don't care if it's a seminary, a law school, a business school, it doesn't matter. Blended education is going to be our future. We are going to be just as much online as we are in person. We're never going back to the old residential model. That's just not going to happen. And there's a really good upside to that because we're reaching people we couldn't normally reach. These broadcasts, these COVID-19 broadcasts that we've been doing have literally reached thousands and thousands of people all over the world. I get notes on LinkedIn and everywhere else from people all over the world who have tuned in. That is a wonderful opportunity. And I'm hearing from pastors that people are coming back to church through the internet that haven't darkened the door of a church in decades. So, there's a lot of opportunity here.
Carol, any thoughts, initial thoughts?
Yeah, so I think one is, of course, thanks for having me as well. Just following up with Ken, so with my primary area, of course, was within the seminary, in the educational area. And so I think there's some great opportunities here as well. Of course, many of us have gone through this cycle, and I've talked to other school teachers and parents as everyone's trying to navigate through online. But I'm also seeing some really interesting things. I think, let me just mention one or two that I've seen. One of them is we're at Seminary. We have a new president, Dr. Sundquist, who's been here for about a year. And one of the things we've always thought of as a seminary, how do we connect in terms of faculty and staff and administration in a busy world? And lo and behold, during the time of the COVID-19, we are connecting. We are connecting via Zoom, but we're also meeting together to pray together every week. And I think these are some wonderful opportunities for building those kind of relationships that we might not have done otherwise. So I hear what you say, Ken, in terms of the shift with the education and what's taking place and some of the surprising good things that are happening. The other interesting thing is a couple of students that I've spoken to have also said, we are longing for each other in person. So I think we're going to see both of those factors, a new shift in terms of how we do these relationships, but also there's a yearning for the in-person, in-face, face-to-face. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with both of those components through to the other side of this.
Yeah, the thoughts from 1 Peter chapter 2, that we're living stones building a spiritual house. Wow, the spiritual house isn't the same thing as what it was, but it's still being built, and the Lord is building us as his holy priest in his new spiritual temple, giving sacrifices, 1 Peter 2. Well, everybody, let's jump into these two periods of time that we're going to look back and learn from for ourselves today in the lives of the people of God in the Old Testament, the period of time in exile and also that of restoration. And as I think of exile, as we begin there, I think immediately of Jeremiah 29. The setting is Babylon. God's people have been transported as prisoners from Jerusalem, some 800 kilometers away from home. They're in Babylon. Now they're disoriented. They're looking back. They're confused. And they're trying to find their way. And Carol, you're going to navigate us through that. Unpack that for us, if you would.
All right, so yeah, let's talk a little bit about exile. I think it's a great place to start in terms of a landing point. And one of the reasons why, of course, is because this is the time 586 BC, when God's people have gone into judgment. So it's really, this incredibly tragic moment within the narrative. You also have, of course, all the curses of the covenant coming upon them. So you have these great calamities that have taken place. And I'm not saying that COVID-19 is to be read in the same way. I know sometimes that can happen within Christian interpretations, that sometimes people are asking the question, is this God's judgment or not? And I don't think it is. I don't think the curses of the covenant is the right place to kind of look for it. So I would pick it back, going back all the way to Genesis chapter 3, and really see that's the narrative I want to put us in terms of the fact of sin and the kind of the creation and what happens as a result. So I think we're in that narrative between Genesis 3 and then Revelation 21 and 22. That's kind of the world that we inhabit. And I would put COVID-19 within that context. Another example would be the plague that is going through, the plague of locusts through East Africa at the moment. That would be another one of these calamities that's taking place that's within the kind of creation groaning. But I think that the story of Israel and the exile at this time is very helpful for us, because they are facing extreme adverse circumstances. They've lost their temple. They've lost the way of worship that they knew it. And so, and I think God is actually using this time to stir in them change and renewal. And Jim, you mentioned the Jeremiah 29, and what's really interesting with that passage, so we're all familiar with it. This is the one that says, that God has plans for good. First of all, you've got to seek the welfare of the city, but then he says, the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for your welfare. So it's a wonderful, hopeful passage for us to think about today. But I also just want to highlight what comes next, because I think this is actually key for our context. The next verse says, then you will call upon me and come and pray, and I will listen to you, and you will seek me, and you will find me. And so one of the things I think God is doing during this disruptive time of the exile is preparing his people, and he's giving them this hunger for himself, and especially in the area of prayer and seeking him, because that's going to become one of the hallmarks of this next time period that we're getting into. And it's really interesting. I noticed recently there's a study that was done at the University of Copenhagen, and they have been looking at Google searches over the past 5 years. And one of the things that they noticed was that in the time in March in particular, they looked at 75 countries, and they said Google searches for prayer skyrocketed at that time. And what's also fascinating is they said that they can trace within particular countries the search about prayer based on when COVID-19 cases began in a particular country. So, we've often seen on the news when we look at this curve, when we talk about flattening the curve, what they say is the curve on prayer was kind of flat. COVID-19 hits a country and prayer goes up. And I think that's what's going on with Jeremiah. It is the distressing circumstances that cause people to want to pray to God and seek him. And so I see this as actually a really interesting moment that we're in, an opportunity that we're in terms of what God may be doing through great suffering and through adversity to draw people to himself. And of course, you think about someone like Daniel, who's in Babylon at this time. And of course, one of the hallmarks of him is, in fact, prayer. And so I think you're starting to see it with him. And this is one of the key areas when you come back after the exile with the return. So I think seeking God, the interest that we're also seeing today in Bible sales. I mean, how about that? Bible sales. Again, during March, Tyndale House said a couple of their key Bible studies and study Bibles, huge one for over 40%, another over 60%. So I think, through great suffering and through great adversity for many people, yet at the same time, this causes us, like it did with the exile, to look to God and to ask him and to pray and seek him. So I'm seeing opportunities here in what God's doing in the big picture.
Great. Thanks so much, Carol. Virginia, how are you seeing this theme of exile in your context?
Well, seeing the space of exile where people are now seeing and that there is a need to return to what they used to have, but even that they weren't practicing. So even as Carol brought out that the people, the children of Israel, although they knew they should have been praying and knew they should have been seeking after God, they weren't. And so now there's a real longing to want to go back to prayer. So I'm seeing prayer meetings, conference call prayers, Zoom call prayers. So everyone wants to pray all of a sudden now. And so even some of the people who never saw at a prayer meeting, and even a lot of ministries who that didn't have the capacity to even be able to get online to be able to do so, they're taking advantage of the free conference calls, and the amount of prayer that has increased, and everyone's asking for prayer for not only their family members but for themselves now. So I'm also seeing people who are now in exile, as it were. They're realizing I'm in my home, I'm stuck with these kids or these family members or the spouse, and I can't get what I want. So the sense of grief and loss, so it's magnified on many levels, especially where we're not only just seeing the exile from the standpoint of go home and work from home, but exile looks like I don't have any money. Exile looks like I don't know how I'm going to pay my rent. Exile looks like I really need to turn to God because there's no one else that can help me in this space. Where before I may have relied on myself or resources and connections or what other substance may have been present, but now it's like I've got to turn to God. So I'm seeing a real desperate need to literally connect faith and life together, where before people were okay with compartmentalizing their faith, but now it's like I need to return to a faith in God. And a lot of questions, I'm getting questions from young people especially that are really trying to grab a hold of what faith really means in their life. And as was stated, I think it's a great opportunity to be able to help youth, help families, and help people to really see, yes, exile is a place where you can find and meet God.
Right. Jason, how about yourself in your context?
Yeah, sure. The first issue that I think about in exile is COVID-19 is first and foremost a health issue. And so unfortunately, last Monday, we lost our first church member to COVID-19. So now we have a grieving widow and a family and a whole church community who has experienced that loss, that exile together. We continue to grieve that this week. We've had several other church members contract COVID and have suffered health problems as a result of that. The others are surviving. I think they're going to be okay. But when it hits that close to home, everyone is scared. And right, so other people who are unemployed or furloughed, it affects everyone. But again, just as Carol was saying, in the exile, God does something in this. And I think that as a pastor, I don't know about in other places, but at least here in Vermont, we have people that get complacent in their faith. And I don't know about you, but we might even have a handful of people who come to church on Sundays simply because that's what we've always done. And maybe their hearts aren't fully engaged in that. But what's interesting is with not being able to attend church, I'm hearing an awful lot of, I can't wait to get back together. I can't wait to pray. I can't wait to actually hug people and touch them and handshake and do all of these things. I have four children, and it's interesting to hear kids saying, boy, I can't wait to get back to school. I never thought I'd ever hear my kids say that. But I went for a long walk with my 14-year-old daughter last night, an hour and a half walk, just the two of us. And yeah, Dad, school's not as bad as I thought it was. And so anyway, there's a lot of different ways that we experience exile in this. Everyone's a little bit different, but there's pain that's going all around. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, a follow-up question to all of you. Ken and Carol, jump in if you I'm seeing people's misplaced hopes being revealed. And all of a sudden, the things that they hoped in, it's not there anymore. Whether it's a misplaced hope in our finances and our security or our schedules or our plans. And in that disruption, we're just having to slow down. And in that slowing down, we're having to reflect of what's actually happening inside us. Is that reflecting in what you're seeing?
Yeah, let me jump in here. Absolutely. My entire life was turned upside down by the fact that, I was in the middle of a speaking tour, and I was supposed to be teaching in Europe back at Oxford this summer. And my wife and I were going to Italy, and la, 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 la. And you build your life around these events that you plan. And there's an old Jewish expression: if you want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. And this has really made it very clear that it's folly for us to plan as though we can control the future. Of course, we need to be prudent and we need to think about the future, but we have to remember that we're not in control. And that's really important.
Right. Yeah.
I just I remember something that that Dr. Sundquist said right at the beginning at one of our meetings, and he said something like, "Wow, these are just amazing, unusual circumstances," and yet in the next breath he said, "But this is actually quite normal." And what he meant by that was, when we start to see what's going on in the global Christian world,
Right.
we're the only unique people that don't face the kind of suffering that is going on globally.
Right.
And I think there is a taking away of some of that external things that we've put our focus on, and start to just get maybe a glimpse of what's going on in the global world. I mean, I think about sometimes seminary students who I know certain parts of where they're going globally, and inside I want to say, I said that to, I don't want you to go back because I know what's ahead, but they understand something more than what we don't understand. So I think this is giving us a little window into really what the kingdom life perhaps is really more all about than what we thought it is.
Moving beyond our own ethnocentricity here in the US and opening it up to what's happening globally. Right.
Yeah, we have a question actually from the audience that I'd like to share, if I may. It's a really interesting question. The question is, do we think the virus came naturally or from a laboratory, whether intentionally or unintentionally? And, I can understand why people want to ask that question, but I don't think it's a helpful question. I think what that does is it gets us in a mindset that we need to blame somebody for what we're experiencing. And I'm sure that, there are government agencies that will look to see whether or not this happened unnaturally. But I think as a church, we need to just assume it happened naturally, because these things always happen. They are a regular part of living in the already but not existence that Carol was talking to earlier. Plagues, pandemics, sickness, cancer, droughts, floods, hurricanes, tornadoes, on and on and on. These things happen in nature all the time. So it's very tempting to want to get into the blame game, but I think as a church, that doesn't help us. It's much better for us to let other people worry about those things, and for the church to ask, how can we heal those who are sick? And how can we reach out to those who are suffering? But I understand the question. I'm not criticizing the question. I'm just saying I think it's a temptation we should probably avoid.
The science here is important because Dr. Francis Collins, who's a believer, has gone through the science of this, and he has written on this, Biologos. You can go online, and he has traced through how this COVID-19 couldn't have been man-made. And so the science itself has been unpacked, and he would be one resource, Ken, that I would direct anybody to. And how he walks us through just the specifics of that were quite convincing to me. But anyway, so that's Exile. Thank you, everybody. It's amazing for us to be able to be in our context today, but to step back into another period of time in the life of the people of God and find an orientation, find a grounding, a defining reality for us today. And so the second period of time that we want to move into is the time of restoration. And Carol, when we began to talk about this, you immediately began to talk about First and Second Chronicles and how this parallels our modern moment as a model of that's going to be a means of being able to reshape our lives for the new normal. And I said, come again? And then as you unpacked it to me, I said, oh, it makes perfect sense. That's right. It's a wonderful place. So unpack that for us.
All right. I promised I wouldn't talk about genealogies.
Yeah,
I remember I had one person when I said, oh, I've been doing some work in Chronicles because I'm working on a commentary. And someone said to me, oh, you mean Chronicles of Narnia? And I'm like, no. Bible Chronicles. So let me just run through, and it's not only the book of First and Second Chronicles, but it's really talking about the time of restoration, because I do think there are several parallel lessons that we can learn from what's going on at that time that really are going to help us to think through our time now. So just, where are they historically? When we think about the post-exilic period. We're thinking from 539 onwards, really the last 100 years of the Old Testament. But this time they go back to Jerusalem and this returning exiles, and of course some are still in Babylon, and we start to see the diaspora of Susa and other places. But there's this group that goes back to Jerusalem, and they're a small province amid a vast Persian Empire. But what's fascinating for me is that you start to see a whole spirituality develop, and I think it's coming from the adversity that's happened through the exile. And I just want to highlight just a couple of things. It's really, of course, we're so familiar now with this passage in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, and that's kind of a good springboard for it. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14 says, "If my people who are called by my name humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, will forgive their sin, and will heal the land." Now, this has been a very popular verse right now, and I've seen a number of references to it. I think there are some ways that we may not have it exactly the right application for it, but here's what I want to pick out. What's fascinating for me when I did work in Chronicles, which is really written during this post-exilic, this last time period, is a couple of emphasis. One is the emphasis on prayer and seeking God. Of course, you have it in this passage, the importance of seeking God, but the passage in Jeremiah already said that this is something God's going to do when they go back as part of the restoration. They're going to seek him, and the delightful thing, it says, and he will be found by them. And we've mentioned already about the importance of prayer at this time that we're in. Let me just give you one example. There are these verbs to seek God's face, which is mentioned in this passage and the one in Jeremiah. There's this one verb, one of the verbs, there's the verb bakash in Hebrew and then darash. This one verb, listen to this, to seek or to inquire, 5 times in Genesis, once in Exodus, twice in Leviticus, 3 times in Samuel, 41 times in Chronicles.
Wow.
41 times. And so that's just one example of something that you didn't see so much earlier that is dominant during this time. You also see fasting starts to turn up at this time. Fasting turns up that is not so dominant earlier. Fasting turns up. What else do you have? You have a time where people are thinking about their mission and identity. And I think that's another key area for us to think through, going back to the scriptures and looking at what their missional worship community is in this new context. And we could also think about emphasis on the kingdom of God. Again, I think it's the fact that they are realizing how insignificant they are within the larger scheme of things, and the kingdom of God becomes very important. And I think that's another key area for us, that you get shaped by recognizing the greater spiritual reality rather than simply just the earthly, the six kind of things that we've been talking about. So I think God is stirring in his people this hunger to seek him, and I think that's precisely what I'm seeing going on now as God is using these adverse circumstances to draw us to himself. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to look at not just the difficulties, but what is God doing in this season to renew and to restore us.
Right. Just one clarifying question in all this, Carol. Explain to us what is distinctive about the history of Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as opposed to 1st and 2nd Kings. It covers some of the material, but there's a lot of material that is unique in how it's put together. Why is that?
So I promised I wouldn't talk about genealogy.
No, you've been great.
But just 2 minutes about genealogies. So the chronicler, we call the author the chronicler, but he's writing, and of course we can think about Ezra and Nehemiah during this time as well. My dear colleagues and friends, Tom and Donna Petter, have just written a wonderful commentary on, fabulous, on Ezra and Nehemiah. I've read material from it. It'll be out in about a couple of months. So they're working on it as well. But the chronicler is not only writing the history of the kings, but you think of it, 9 chapters of genealogies. Why? He's showing that Israel's purpose, they've got this little province amidst this vast Persian Empire, and he's saying God's plan for his people has not changed. So he goes back to the genealogies and he puts them in this global context, because it's fascinating. The Table of Nations is mentioned in the opening genealogies. Why? To show that they are a missional community. Their calling is being lived out as a worshiping missional community. So the chronicler does all these little sermons in there, like the one we just said in 2 Chronicles 7, the prayer of Jabez. There's sermons throughout, calling people, looking at these stories, calling them back to a new spiritual reality. Virginia, you mentioned about people crying out to God for help. That's another huge, interesting, isn't it? It's another huge theme in Chronicles, people crying out for help. It's not in Kings, and I think it marks our time as well.
Right. Ken, you are telling me that you have a great question. You want to break for the question, or should I turn?
Yeah, let's interject this, because it's so pertinent to what you're just talking about. People are please keep sending in the questions, folks. They're great questions. I wish I could ask all of them. We're trying to condense them. So the situation in pre-exilic Israel, the temple worship was very different than the post-exilic. And of course, the diaspora, the synagogue experience, dramatically different than the temple experience. People are saying, what is post-COVID going to look like? What can we expect? Worship and the way we even use our buildings, for instance. The most underutilized asset in America is church buildings from Monday to Saturday. So they're asking really great questions. What can we expect? What about people who maybe now are going to be afraid to come back to church because people aren't going to wear masks, and 80% of our parishioners are over 70, and so they're asking really great questions. How can we be prepared spiritually and practically for this kind of post-exilic experience that you're talking about? Carol, thank you for unpacking that. That was brilliant. So, Jim, if you want to tee off on that and have the others discuss it, I'm getting a lot of questions on that.
Right. Well, that's why, Carol, in responding to you, Ken, that's why I went through 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles for like 3 times in the last couple of days, just to refresh myself. What is there for our moment today? And it's a retraining tool for the realities of what they're facing in exile. Same with us. There's a retraining that God is doing in a new wineskin. And 1 and 2 Chronicles are the place that we would invite you to dig in and begin to hear new lessons for a new form of church and a new form of life, so that spirituality of worship that's there is rebirthed again in the exile. Same with us. So, Virginia, any thoughts on this?
Yes, I think in this time and season, this exile has allowed us to strip everything down. So all of our programs got stripped away, all of the excess stuff that we're doing that we don't necessarily know why, but we either chased dollars or we chased because some other church was doing it. So I think what the church is going to begin to look like, part of that new wineskin, I think it's driving us all back, as Carol just said, to the why. Why does our church exist? What's the call on us? What is the missioner asking of us in this season? And how do we do that? And I think it's sending us all back to the space of why, and why are we serving, and why are we doing what we're doing? And I believe the church post-COVID has to go back to the foundation stone and stripping away all of the flash and stripping away all of the unnecessary things, bringing us back to the basic. And I think we have to be careful not to rebuild or try to rebuild the old temple that the Lord clearly may not want us to build.
Right.
So I think that this season of inquiring of him and asking, who are we reaching and what do we need to be doing in the season? So what is it going to look like? I think it's still to be determined. But I agree 100%. We can't go back to the old time way, as it were. And that seems to be the cry of many people. Young people are even asking, what is it going to look like? And I think that that is going to be, I think it's a multi-layered question. I think leadership has to pause and go back and visit the why. I also think we as people have to pause and say, what is our role? And did we get too busy with our kids in 50,000 different lessons and too busy for the house of faith? And did we get too preoccupied and just too all over the place? So I think I don't think the church should be rushing to answer this question right now either, I want to say. God is clearly calling us to inquire of him, to rest in him, to pause, to pray, to have some times of fasting and prayer even. And I think we need to allow what the new wineskin is going to look like to be birthed out of a place of inquiring of the Lord, and not rebuild some of those old structures.
Right. Excellent. Yeah. Jason, what thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting to talk to various people, and you again, you sort of see a spectrum or continuum of some people say, no, I think life's going to go back to pretty much the way it was once we get through this. I just can't wait for that to happen. Other people said the world's never going to be the same again in terms of healthcare, education, and certainly the church. And so again, I agree with Virginia. We don't really know what's going to happen. And I think to try to predict that is impossible to do. But what we can do is, I affirm what she said. I think that this has stripped away. Again, as a pastor, someone who deeply cares about the spiritual vitality of not only my church, but my local community, my state, I pray for idols to be removed. And lo and behold, what happens? You know, we here in America, at least, we worship money, we worship our sports, our leisure activities, and all of a sudden, boom, guess what? We can't do any of these things. I had to laugh last week. Gasoline prices are as low as they've been in years. I thought, all the gas, but nowhere to go. It's just the reality that we're facing. And so I think, at least for the church, it's brought us back to some real basic issues of, for instance, Sabbath. We as Americans are not particularly good at Sabbath or taking a break, of resting, relaxing. And now all of a sudden, I think God has forced us to stop and take a look. And I'm hearing people ask all sorts of questions about what is really important in life. What's really important for good health care? What is really important for good education? What's really important for just church? And so I think, old virtues like simplicity, frugality, we have to come back and think about some of these. The situation has forced us to do that. And I think, as with the Exile, I've heard a lot of people say we shouldn't waste a good crisis. And I couldn't agree with that more. Here we are in this situation. Let's learn from it. Let's get refocused as a result of this. Even back in Jeremiah 29, it was very interesting. Jeremiah sends this letter off to the exiles, and he says, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce, marry and have sons and daughters. Those are pretty basic things in life. Get married, have kids, plant gardens. And again, I think it forced me to say, gosh, what really is important about my ministry? We have to do that. Maybe not. And so again, it's a good reset to think about it.
Well, we're going to keep moving in biblical history here, because this one final section is something I know will generate some significant conversation among us. So let me lead us into this next question from Nehemiah 5. And here's the reality. All of us, regardless of if we're wealthy or poor or here or there, all of us are going through this pandemic. We're all in the same boat. But here's the reality of that. Not all of us are going through this in the same kind of boat. So maybe some of you caught the tweet that this multi-billionaire sent around the world. He's got this picture of this like 200-foot or so yacht, and describes that it can have 16 guests and 43 crew, and it's got a gym, and it's got a basketball court, and it's got like a ballroom and all this stuff. And his tweet to the world was, hello from, I think it was the Caribbean, hope you're all safe. Like that. So we're not all in the same boat. We're going through this, but we're certainly not in the same boat. And so Anne Voskamp, she, I thought, nailed it when she said, some, their boat, some are holding onto a piece of driftwood in the open sea. And so that's the same kind of dynamic that was happening in this restoration period that Nehemiah 5 opens up for us. Carol, unpack that for us, because this is timely for us today.
Yeah, so Nehemiah 5 is an interesting passage. Again, I think of my good friend Tom Petter, who has been working in this, and we've had some conversations about it. But Nehemiah 5 is very interesting because I've sort of missed this over. You think about Nehemiah and building the walls and these things, but yet in the midst of this book, during the Persian time period, this post-exilic time period, you know, it doesn't go as well for them as what it is in Babylon. I mean, it's tough going, and you have high Persian taxes that people have to pay. You have chapter 5 of Nehemiah talks about the fact that people are being burdened, and some have even had to sell their land. And Nehemiah rebukes the wealthy who are taking advantage of the situation. I mean, it's a great chapter. I refer you to it to read, but he's like, what on earth are you doing taking advantage of those who are suffering right now? So he rebukes them, takes them head on, and says, you need to give it back, you know. So I think picking up the contemporary context, I think there's some great lessons here, because we're reminded there are wealthy and there are poor at the same time. And how do we treat each other? Then on top of that, then Nehemiah, he doesn't take the tax that is due to him as governor, and it says he feeds. He's got like 150. He's feeding at his table, even among some of the nations. And I think about, you know, I was talking to a student in one of my classes just the other day who's in Boston, who's actually writing a blog at the moment and really saying, what's the role of those who have jobs helping those who haven't got jobs? How do we think through this? I think about when you have, you know, with certain organizations, when you have salary cuts, but those in higher leadership take a higher cut than the lower, you know, those sorts of things. I think Nehemiah is a great place for us to be thinking through that.
Right. Yeah, it opens up all kinds of questions here. In Boston, the stats of, you know, the people that are dying, 27% are white, 67% are African-American, Latino, and Asian, 67%. So there are some huge realities that are being revealed through this. Virginia, would you respond to some of this for us?
Yes, this has really brought to the surface inequities that have already existed as far as healthcare issues, because we're clear that COVID, unfortunately, people who already have pre-existing conditions, that COVID magnifies that. The economic side of it. Even I remember just being told at the seminary that we were going to be closing the building and that we would go and work from home. Well, some of our maintenance people sat there, and I remember one of them raising her hand saying, well, do I get to clean my house, and do you pay for me to clean my house? So just little things like that. No, we don't all get to go home and work from home. And so just the little inequities, and I say little, and I'm using that kind of facetiously, but those inequities that have taken place in our judicial system and our healthcare system and even our academic systems. So we have some children that, while you're hearing on the news, teachers are driving by children's homes and celebrating them, and teachers are working with some students. I have some students, and I know of some parents that have complained they haven't heard from their teachers, or what they're getting are maybe glorified babysitting lessons, but they're really concerned that their children have lost a good chunk of this school year. And the concern is, where will they be in the fall? Will they be promoted? What is their learning? They don't have books. They don't have the resources to even continue on to scale. So I think definitely there are issues that this has brought to the surface, and this is to me where the voice of the church gets to speak out again and to address
Absolutely.
some of these things by simple means of maybe changing what we're serving in some of our coffee hour fellowships, so that people can see that there's a healthier way of eating, that we now get and try to encourage parents and others to get involved in their local school systems so that things aren't so inequitable. So I think that this is clearly bringing and exasperating issues that already existed. It's not creating new issues, but it is truly bringing, as separating the grease is rising to the top. It's here. Now the question will be post-COVID, how will we address those issues? Or will we just sweep them under the rug again once we're past this? Or will we pause and say, we've really got to start looking at some of these and how do we address them from a holistic perspective?
Right, right. Yeah. Jason.
Yeah, sure. I think that, these issues get manifested in a lot of different ways, and all I know is that with the crisis on, that our church has responded to multiple families in need in our community in ways that we haven't in the past, with unemployment issues, just people out of work trying to make ends meet. Well, there's an opportunity for the church to step up, whether they're church members or community members.
Right.
We had some community members who never darkened the door of our church, out of work, and then had a stroke on top of that. And one of our members became aware of that need, and so our leadership board immediately responded. We've been blessed with some resources, and now's the time to disperse those and use them to help people out. I've talked to other neighboring churches and communities. Food shelves have been hit hard since the crisis has taken place. So again, I think that we need to be sensitive to the people and to the needs of our communities around us, and respond in whatever we can with the love of Christ and with the gospel and with tangible means.
Yeah, right. Yeah, great. Thanks to both of you. Ken, you have a question?
We've got lots of questions coming in from people who are watching, and it's just fantastic.
Right.
One of them I'd like to ask, Carol, as you know, in the 2nd century of the church era, there was a terrible plague in Rome, and it was Christians who were willing to take the risks to go out and to minister to the people who were suffering. And that was one of the great periods of church growth in our history. It wasn't by particularly people standing on street corners and preaching. It was by these acts of loving kindness. Today, what opportunities does the church have to do two things? One, meet these physical needs that Jason was alluding to and Virginia was alluding to, but also this loneliness epidemic that already existed before COVID-19,
Right.
which has been seriously exacerbated by COVID-19. How can we use this as an opportunity to witness to people, to be Christ to these people?
Carol.
Yes. So I think, I just responding with what Jason just said. I think that's a wonderful place through the local church, and also with what Virginia's talking about. So I think, these are the places when you see God's people acting sacrificially. At the moment, we've had so many of the first responders that have been doing this. We see them on the news all the time that really just laying down their life. So I think certainly the place of the church, the loneliness piece, I had some students the other day said an interesting comment. They said, for many of our generation, we've kind of just done the Netflix thing, and it's almost like God saying, well, here, you want it? Here you have it, and see what it's really like. I'd never thought about that, but it was kind of like, because part of what's happening, of course, with the social media is the loneliness, right? And if you're talking to an Australian here, so Ken, you know what I'm talking about. It's a different culture in terms of Australian culture versus American culture. But yeah, I think we have to be intentional about relationships. I think it's, again, coming from someone from Australia, New England's particular, where we are, for some of us, New England can be particularly isolating. And perhaps even through this calls us to be in community because we realize we really do need each other.
Right.
By the way, we had a comment. It wasn't a question. I kid you not. We had a comment from Australia. Love the accent. So it made them feel very much that they were part of it.
All right.
So I have a question for Jason. Jason, China's been getting a really bad rap, and some of it well-deserved. But China's really been getting a very bad rap during this whole pandemic. You and I have both spent a lot of time in China. I think there's a lot of things that we can learn from the Chinese church. I wonder if you could share with the folks who are watching what we in the West could learn from the Chinese church during this pandemic, because they've had to reinvent themselves a lot.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ken. As you know, I've been there several times in the last few years. Actually, just last year we were there together. And the first thing that I would say is this, that it's been so discouraging to hear on the news and in social media how denigrating people have been toward our Chinese brothers and sisters. And I certainly don't want to make this political, but when we have leaders using racist terms like the Chinese virus, it's just painful as Christians. Carol, you mentioned the Table of Nations a few minutes ago. I just preached that text in Genesis 10 a few weeks ago, and that was my central point, is we're all descendants of Noah. We're all brothers and sisters. How dare us put the blame on any one people group for a pandemic like this? And so when we have friends and brothers and sisters who live in other places, it's not the place to denigrate. And actually, I think we can learn a lot from the Chinese church from this. So as many of you know, China lives in a very different political climate than what we do here in America. And they're simply not allowed to have large meetings for the house churches. And so we've met with lots of pastors that with the pressure that they have from the government, that once they even get to above 50 or sometimes 100 people, then the government will come and just shut them down. And so this is a reality that they live with all the time. And yet we watch these churches thrive and flourish in so many ways. The other thing is the Chinese church is vastly under-resourced, especially compared to what we are here with. We have so many materials for Bible studies, and many of them, they just simply don't have it. We have theological education. After all, we're Gordon-Conwell tonight, and many pastors there have had a high school education, maybe university, but no theological training leading churches. And so again, I think it comes back to very simple ministry models. That's what I've witnessed in China, is it's God's word going through God's people, reaching people for Christ, people loving each other, caring for each other's needs. And so I think to look at some of those realities that the Chinese church constantly faces, we can just simply learn from that and say, we've been forced into a not exactly the same situation, but at least some similarities that we didn't have before. So I've been so inspired by our brothers and sisters in China in particular, and just how they love the Lord, even through times of adversity and difficulty. I would start with that at least, Ken.
Right. And Ken, I know that your next live stream of COVID-19 is going to address some of these issues of prejudice and slighting ethnic issues.
Yeah, we're going to probably call it "Who is my neighbor?" and we will really start thinking very, very deeply about what that means as a church. I have one last question from the audience that I'd like to share. I think it's a really good one. Maybe if all of you could jump in on this. How do we help people overcome the fear of going back to church? Because like we said, it's probably going to be a blended existence moving forward. And hopefully we'll learn a lot more different ways to do ministry. Online, in person, use our buildings better. All the ideas that came up tonight are brilliant. But there are a lot of people who are just going to be afraid. So how do we lovingly talk them through that? And how do we accommodate them if they're not able to get over their fears? I think this is a really insightful question from from the audience. Anyone would like to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that one, Ken, myself, if I may. Yeah, because I've been thinking about this in light of Judges 6. And here you have Gideon withdrawn into this private place because of the oppression of the Midianites. And he's threshing wheat in a wine press. So he's completely withdrawn. And this fear-based reality is what is defining his life. But God intervenes and begins to call him out into engagement. And through that, he finds his way to re-enter. So I've been finding help in thinking through Judges 6 and the life of Gideon. So what others do you think on this?
I'd like to jump in here. So I've been engaging with some conversations with youth leaders through Orange this past couple of days. And so we're looking at it on a multi-level. So the church as a whole, and then even with youth ministry, where a lot of it is relational, it's touchy-feely. So I think part of it is that the internal fears that we have, they're going to be there. And I think we need to be okay that we're all going to be a little bit more cautious, just as after 9/11 travel changed. So everything went to 1 quart bag and 3 ounces or less. So there are going to be some changes that are just going to be inevitable. There's some talk about services maybe remaining or going to 50 to 75 people, depending on the capacity of your building, literally cutting that, whatever it is, into half. So I think as churches, we're talking about this even as my husband is a pastor and our church ministers staff are talking about it, that it means we're going to have to clean differently. It means that there may be more hand sanitizers around the building. It may mean social distancing and the seating. We might have to take a few rows of pews out so that we can accommodate people to the degree that we can. It may mean also that the electronic side of streaming our services doesn't go away, because especially for our older population that may be concerned, or even some that have compromised immune systems, they may still want to watch for a while. It may even mean that we don't necessarily roll out and start opening our churches as soon as the gate is open, let's go running. No, it may mean that some of us roll out and wait until the second or third wave of openings. So we're actually examining a lot of things to say that I think it's going to be a comprehensive plan, and it's going to have to be something that we are okay and just acknowledge that that fear is going to be there. Will we have those units in front of the church where it reads people's temperature before coming in? And if so, who decides? Does security say, oh, you can't come in the church? So, these are questions that we're wrestling with. And honestly, we don't have all of the answers yet.
Great. Yeah. Ken, back to you.
Yeah. We've just had fantastic questions. And this last question is about leadership. What really is the role of the leaders in our churches, the leaders in our cultures? What is the most important thing that leaders can do right now to help people deal with the impact of this virus? Church leaders and community leaders. What's the most important thing you believe they can do? Because almost all the people who are pastors are leaders in their community, and people are looking to them for guidance. They're not just looking to governors and presidents, and they're looking to local people whom they know and they love and they trust. So I would like to put that question out there. It was a great question that came from one of the viewers.
Right. Jason, do you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, sure. I think certainly people are always looking for leadership, especially in times of crisis and times of fear. They want a non-anxious presence, someone who I think the best thing we can do as leaders is number one, to model trust in God. That if I'm not doing that myself, how can I expect anyone else to do that? That it's easy to preach, do not be anxious about anything, but it's a lot harder to live that. And so I think it starts right with us to say, okay, God's in control of this, and that might mean we have to change and continue to adapt to various realities, but we're willing to do that. And I think people are looking for wisdom. And again, if you just watch news broadcasts, you see a lot of foolishness, a lot of foolish things being said. It's not helpful, especially when it comes from leaders. And then that creates a sort of a pretense of hypocrisy. And what we need is just good wisdom to say, stay at home. That's what makes the most sense for us to do right now. Let's continue to love each other and take advantage of the opportunities we have. Again, back to Jeremiah 29, for us to do our part to make the best of a bad situation. So let's model it, let's preach it, let's encourage it, and let's guide and help people walk through it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, just for my own, is I don't think there's ever been a time where it's so exciting to preach and teach the Bible, because there is such power and relevance for the Word of God today in the issues that people are facing. And so in terms of leadership, to be able to unpack the scriptures so that people are able to see who God is and how God is the one to be able to hope in, and to be able to literally have the scriptures be reshaping people in the midst of this COVID crisis, and to be that sort of cultural influence that people are aching for, because they're not going to get it through binging on whatever Netflix series. They're going to get it from the Word of God. And so just practically, there's never been a greater opportunity to be able to do what we walk through Gordon-Conwell to be prepared for. And that is to preach and teach God's Word to the lives of people today in our churches and in our communities. So that would be one reality that's been just so, just with clarity in my heart. And I think there's other things in the community that we can reach out to, the kind of stuff, Ken, that you and I were involved in Europe with the Trinity Forum and our Conversations of Consequence in the communities. There's never been a more wide open opportunity for people to have a chance to actually talk about issues that really matter, and they're open to it. And for us to be able to provide the venue for those conversations of consequence to happen within our communities. So those just a quick couple of things from my own corner there, Ken. So what's next for us, Ken?
Well, we're really pushed up against the time now. So I would ask everyone to just, what's the last thought you want to leave with everyone here? And then I have a few closing details that I'd like to share with everyone. And I really want to thank everyone for those incredible questions that came. You've really encouraged us to think more deeply, and we hope you've encouraged each other. So going around the horn, maybe we can go Jason, Carol, Virginia, and then Jim. What's the last thing you'd like to leave with people tonight? Jason?
Yeah, let me reiterate the comment that I made earlier. Don't waste a good crisis. God has given us an opportunity here to really pause, to reset, to reflect. I think individually and corporately. I know just in my own heart, I've really had to stop and think about what's important in my own life, in my own ministry. And adversity helps us do that in ways that I think nothing else can. And so if we go through this period of time and sort of lockdown and don't learn anything from it, we've really missed a good opportunity.
Right.
So yeah, I think I would echo what Jason just said. I think this is a time to see what God is doing rather than only seeing the adversity and all the struggles, to see that God, what he's doing in terms of what he's birthing in us, in terms of these kind of this spirituality, this focus on his kingdom work instead of all the other stuff that we focus on. So I think my encouragement would be to seek the Lord, to see what he would be doing in your own ministry. And then second thing is read Chronicles.
Read Chronicles. Yeah.
Virginia?
As the government looks at reopening cities and reopening aspects of our country, especially regarding the realm of business, I would encourage ministries, as we're also beginning to look at post-COVID for our churches, to look at some of the resources that we've taken over this time and we've poured into that 1 hour or 2 hour service on a Sunday morning. How can we take some of those resources and pour them into the rest of the hours of the week to actually minister to our communities, to our families, and be about the mission that God has called us to be about? So I would encourage us, as we're inquiring of the Lord, to ask him, how can we reshift, refocus, and how can we realign to be about the mission that he's called us to?
Excellent. Jim?
Yeah, I would say two things real quick. I think the first is the task of leadership in leading the church to be able to recognize and to step into the new wineskin moment that the Lord is calling us, given the circumstances, and for us to find wisdom from God to give shepherding expertise for that to happen, so that the church can step into the wineskin and that the Lord wants to fill in a new way. So that would be the first thing, the challenge and the importance of leadership in our local churches. The second is that of this whole thing with Nehemiah 5 has caused me to really pause. And I've talked with different people about this. And I think that there's a real opportunity here for us to pause. And a great podcast that I recently listened to, Donna Harris, and it was on creativity for action. And what she's suggesting is, before we go out and start serving, to begin to look at the realities of what's happening, what's unfolding, what's being revealed, and to have a time of lament. And then in that lament space, to be able to feel and to sense, this is not right. And in that space, to seek the Lord and to find, what is it that I would do? How is it that I would be able to step into something that would be intentional, that would be part of people resourcing each other in new ways for new relationships between communities. So the stronger and the weaker in various capacities can bless each other, because everybody has strengths and everybody has weaknesses, regardless of where they live. And for that to happen and for that to foster more and more. So I'm looking for new networks that can be able to facilitate that kind of sharing across suburban and urban and rural. So that would be my closing.
Wonderful. Well, I'll just share one small anecdote from my time in England. I was on the staff of a church that was built in the 14th century. And the pastor decided that he was going to take the recommendation of an architect to get rid of the pews and replace them with chairs so that they could use the sanctuary for lots of different things. Well, you can imagine the outcry. There were people in that town who had never gone to church who came out and protested the removing of those pews. And my very wise friend, who was the senior pastor, reminded them that actually for the first 500 years that that church existed, there were no pews. It was a Victorian invention. So we have to not be afraid to do new things, because as Carol just reminded us, actually, the history of God's people is the history of us finding new ways to be God's people, to be the church. Don't be afraid of what's coming down the pike. Don't be afraid to be creative, because all that matters is that we worship him in spirit and in truth. So Amen. It's been an absolutely wonderful, wonderful event. Thank you to everyone. On behalf of the Seminary, the Mockler Center, the Public Square Forum, I want to thank everyone for being part of this event. And we hope you did find it to be useful and inspiring. Please stay in touch via the website. There are going to be more events like this, including the one I mentioned a minute ago, Who is Our Neighbor? That will be on the 21st of May. There's information about the seminary. It should be appearing on your screen right now with different links. You can always go to gordonconwell.edu. And I'd like to encourage you to consider enrolling in courses at Gordon-Conwell. Now is a fabulous time to take an online summer course, to take a course in discipleship, take a course in church history, take a course in biblical studies. whether you want to take it for credit or you just want to audit it, we are inviting you to be part of this thoughtful, loving, Christ-centered community of global discipleship. The workers are few, and we are doing kingdom work, so we'd love you to be part of it. In the meantime, God bless you, good night, and stay safe.